long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Will Miller, political scientist now employed as an associate vice president with Campus Labs. And joining me again today is Alexandra Philandra, an associate professor of political science at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Alexandra, it's great to have you back on the show and to be doing this again with you.
Wonderful to talk to you again, Will.
Yeah, and I think it's another fun week. I mean, this is obviously a week when we sort of set out to determine what to talk about, where obviously we're at that point in the political season, or maybe the Trump presidency or the world in general, where we have plenty of things to choose from and plenty of things that we could possibly look to discuss. So it's always nice when we have some fun options and some fun topics. But I figured maybe with everything that happened in the last week that we'd start by actually talking about what I kind of coined President Trump Goes to Europe, and sort of how the Europeans perceived of Trump's trip, what happened in the UK, what happened with Normandy. So let's start with, what's your general sense on the trip and how it went for Trump?
Well, I think the reviews are mixed. It was a relief to people that he appeared presidential in the very limited sense of sort of carrying out duties while giving the speech about Normandy that were not politicized, that were not about American partisan politics, that were not spiteful or anything, that it was actually the script that he was supposed to follow in a solemn occasion like that. But then all kinds of strange things followed him from there. His response to Pelosi, the fact that he took the entire family there who were doing their own business, the fact that he stayed in his own hotel in Ireland and flew over to France for the festivities and for events from there rather than staying in France. What he said to the Irish Prime Minister while in the official visit there, the whole presentation with the Queen and the official dinner with the Queen, everything that surrounded the visit seemed to be off compared to the way American presidents traditionally have done things in Europe and presented themselves in Europe.
I mean, you didn't even mention the tweet storm upon landing towards the mayor of London either, which obviously I think had people extremely concerned about how the rest of the trip was going to go, given that it started right before touchdown with some fairly direct and fairly derogatory comments. But some are going to argue also some very blunt comments that are in line with what Trump has historically believed and historically said. And I think that's kind of the question I'm faced with after this visit. The Normandy speech, I would say, was probably the best moment of Trump's presidency. And I say that even if the bar wasn't, as you kind of pointed out, maybe a little bit lower, given that we're just happy he stayed on script. I think even if he was a more traditional practice president, that speech would have been a shining light. But even in the speech, if we really think about it and we look at the content, it emphasized what Trump normally emphasized. It wasn't about group action. It was about nationalism. He was very clear in calling out individual countries and their contributions to the war effort, as opposed to seeing this as an all versus all or an all versus some. So, I mean, even those undertones kind of appeared in that sense as well, maybe more than we're necessarily giving credit for still making sure it did mission align with his sort of political vision for the world.
No, I think you're right. It is true that the speech itself, we were relieved because the delivery was quite within the normal bounds of presidential politics, and the speech itself was within, again, sort of normal bounds, but the message, you're absolutely right, was a fairly nationalistic message, even though he talked about the assistance that nations gave to each other, it was from the perspective of individual nations. It wasn't the one world, we are all one approach to international politics, for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's a key piece of this is knowing that he has still stuck to that message and been able to appropriately, in this case, align it with a larger event, an event that I believe it appears pretty clear that he recognized was significantly greater than he himself as one individual. But if we go back and kind of talk about the British swing at the initial takeoff here, I mean, if we look at what happened to the mayor, if we look at, as you've kind of described, some of the awkwardness in the interactions with the Queen and the state dinner, the bringing of the entire family, even the push for the next generation conversation. I know that caused a lot of concern with some American voters, and especially some on the left, the idea that he wanted Prince William and Prince Harry to meet with Ivanka and John Jr. and the next generation of leaders, almost viewing himself as, the first in a long line of maybe hereditary American leaders. Are there positives to that approach, or is this all something that's going to be looked at, 2 months down the road as questionable and a drain on taxpayers?
I don't see a lot of positives, but I don't think that there will be time, given the way the political time evolves these days in the United States. I don't think that we'll remember what happened in Europe in June by September, because by September we will have the 12 Democratic debates and 11 whatever and like 23 candidates, and it's like we'll be so incredibly busy that it's really hard to be reflective and retrospective and be able to put things into context when so many things are happening constantly. And it's not just, I mean, it was very strange to see him talk about the next generation, but it was also incredibly strange to again push back that there were no protests and all the people who were out on the street were there to celebrate him, when clearly that was not the case, and he was once again lying. And we have seen him basically fib and promote fake news so frequently that it's altering reality for us. I mean, it's just, we can't. What do you do with that?
Yeah, and I mean, it is kind of a full-time job to figure out, where are we stretching, where are things coming out of left field or right field, where is he maybe taking a true point and using it in a different way than intended. I think that's definitely a different piece of this presidency. I think that's my big question still in general. And Alexandra, I don't know what you've seen with your colleagues, but being completely transparent, and I've said this before on the show, I have former colleagues that I respected and really appreciated their academic insights that I have zero faith in anymore, because they are just blinded by their political leanings and unable to even attempt to objectively assess what Trump does or doesn't do. And I think what's been interesting to me is it almost feels like in some ways the way that Trump is being perceived within, again, the ivory tower, within academics, is that we don't like him because he doesn't fit a box. Like, it's not even necessarily that we're opposed to the Twitter storm that happens when he lands in London, as much as we have no historical comparison. We don't know how to compare what he's doing in Europe versus what previous presidents have done who have followed tradition, because, to be honest, Trump just doesn't care about tradition. I think we've seen that at this point pretty clearly. So my question is, how are academics in your eyes going to handle the Trump presidency 5 or 10 years down the road when we do our academic reflection, given the fact that, this isn't a guy who falls into a typology. There's not a previous leader where we could say he's a lot like this in how he behaves, because he just says what he wants to say. And that's very new for us.
Well, I think in many respects, he will be a baseline for, basically, we will adjust all of our thinking about the presidency on the basis of this, as the low point baseline in terms of like what is like the absolute outlier in terms of behaviors, in terms of commitments to policy, in terms of um, knowledge, interest, ability to process. I mean, he is a complete outlier in 99% of dimensions. And I don't know that Trump doesn't care about tradition because it depends on what you mean by tradition, because he certainly cares about pomp and circumstance and tradition in that sense. When to show up and put on formal wear and be with the queen, that type of tradition he's very much into. The other kinds of traditions that are hampering him and that are frustrating him, then he doesn't like it. It's not the tradition he doesn't like, it's the constraints that certain types of norms put on him.
That is true. And I guess even thinking about the 4th of July parade idea and all of those pieces, that's definitely tradition-based. And I think you're right. The point I was really getting at was if it's tradition for the sake of tradition and he doesn't see personal benefit, that tends to get punted out the window. I mean, if I'd go back and make the historical argument, this is not the guy the framers would have wanted setting tradition like Washington did for future presidents, obviously.
In a sense, he's going to be setting up the lower bound of traditions, like the what not to do. You don't put your daughter and brother and son-in-law as top advisors. You don't select personnel in government based on who can protect your personal interests. You all the things that you don't do, and that other people in the past, other presidents, other candidates sort of followed on a normative base because they recognized it or basically thought that there would be way too much pushback. So they did it whether they liked it or not. Now I think there is going to be an effort to actually certain norms become laws and become sort of transcribed and in stone. And we're seeing that with legislation in states that require presidential candidates to submit their tax forms. And we will be seeing that with more and more legislation that would have to do with clarifying what an executive can and can't do. Like, officially, no, Ivanka cannot be a presidential advisor.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense. And I think that's definitely reflecting sort of the protean nature of norms and expectations of a president. And I do think you're right on a baseline. I'm not going to necessarily agree that this will forever be the low on the baseline across all dimensions, but I do think it's definitely kind of that gut check of, okay, we've seen one extreme, we've seen another extreme. What is it we actually want out of a president? Because I do think, and we're going to talk about this here in a little bit, but if we go back to the Midwestern voter, who's the topic of interest for the next few years in a lot of ways, there are a lot of people there that still may not appreciate Donald Trump's policies, but do appreciate the bluntness and the transparency with which he shares frustration. I think that still resonates, and it's going to be figuring out how do we balance acting presidential and being presidential on a world stage with still being willing to call a spade when push comes to shove.
From my perspective, how I understand partisanship from a psychological perspective, the behavior, it's sort of incidental. I think that people in today's America, partisanship has become such a strong social identity that people are willing to justify and accept and become enthusiastic even for any kind of behavior. So I think that if Trump tomorrow became, a model reserved politician like, the Prime Minister of Japan, you'd still have the Republicans saying, that's great. And you see that flip, there was this really funny, not funny situation with Hannity the other day where he was, without any irony, aghast that the Democrats are trying to pursue um, impeachment, and that Nancy Pelosi said that, in her view, Trump should be in prison and should want to see him in prison. And without any sense of irony or history, Sean Hannity turns around and says, we are not a banana republic that seeks to lock up political opponents. And I'm like, this is not even funny. Like, you don't remember like what you were saying 2 weeks ago.
Lock her up.
Yeah, exactly. Lock her up. And the thing is, you sort of change what you say, and a lot of the partisans follow. And this is, of course, on both sides. This is not a Republican thing, because it is also funny to see the enthusiasm about free trade among Democrats. Like, Democrats suddenly have become like so in love with free trade. It's like, what happened to the leftist and socialistic sort of part of the Democrats?
Yeah, and that wasn't there 6 years ago. That's entirely a sea change recently.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the idea, like that the left has fought free trade for over a century, and suddenly you have a Republican president who is imposing tariffs and protecting national industries, and the left is like screaming and pulling its hair out. And it's like, wow, what happened to you people?
Yeah, exactly.
So it's you see this equivalent response that is a partisan emotional response, has nothing to do with the merit of the policy or the behavior, and which actually in itself, the fact that that's how we respond to politics as group members, and like sort of, and that's it in many ways, is it's quite scary.
No, I definitely agree. It's definitely kind of that vitriol response that we see a lot of people having today, like you said, regardless. I do think if Trump came out tomorrow as the model leader, there'd be a whole lot of questions and concerns about what's happened to him. But I do agree. I don't think his numbers are going to, quote unquote, change per se based on it.
People rationalize. They just are able to really easily rationalize in politics in order to reduce, the uncomfortable feeling of what is known as dissonance. So you find a nice post facto explanation that says, no, he has never been aggressive and, having these Twitter storms or whatever. That never happened. I mean, when people actually, when there's experimental evidence that people, when you show them pictures from the inauguration, they tell you, no, this is a full stadium, or this is a full arena, whatever. And, the picture clearly is not what it's showing. And basically, partisanship literally blinds you to pictorial reality. It's really easy for people to actually, out of partisanship, to just, completely reinvent reality tomorrow. And of course, the problem here is that normal politicians put a bit of a constraint to this. They use what is known as spin, but they didn't used to go beyond spin, because spin is sort of the early form of fake news. You sort of push for a narrative that is consistent with what you want to say, which may not be exactly consistent 100% with reality. Like if you made a mold of reality and put the thing on top, they wouldn't quite fit. but it wouldn't be a completely different thing either. Now we are in the time where reality doesn't matter anymore, and you just say whatever. And people apparently are willing to go along even with that.
But I think that's what people want. I'm going to push back on that. I think in the age of social media, people want to be able to say whatever they want to say and put it out whatever way they want to put it out. And all we're seeing here is back to that norm question of a president who's doing the exact same thing that every other person in America that's on social media is basically doing, where we pick and choose what we share, how we share it, how we contextualize it. No matter what we say, half the people respond with, yes, you're right, and half the people respond with, that's wrong. So I think it's a larger societal symptom that's where news comes from today, when it's always through one person's view of what that news is.
Yes, I mean, we have personalized reality in a sense, and we don't have a neutral, in quotes, arbiter, which the evening news and newspapers used to be, with whatever slight slant they used to have. Today we have pretty much, we're back into, the 1840s with partisan newspapers and partisan sources of information, and all your reality and all your information essentially is coming from there. But even with that, like, again, I have spent enough time, a good portion of my life in Europe, where you do have a tradition of partisan newspapers, but even there, where the newspapers clearly take a partisan position, it wasn't, at least in the 90s and the early 2000s, that I was a witness to this. It wasn't a complete breakdown of reality. It wasn't, what's up is down and what's down is up. Today, it's like basic facts are being questioned, and sometimes it becomes funny, right? Because Trump sent Pence out to talk about how we're going to go to the moon and how it's important for the U.S. to go to the moon, and then he comes out on Twitter yesterday and says, "Who wants to go to the moon? That's ridiculous. That's a waste of money. We've already been to the moon." Like, I have no idea.
And it's even more ironic here on the same day that NASA says that you can rent the International Space Station for $35,000 a night per astronaut.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's insane. And then you have I believe, the FDA administrator saying that what a double-blind, experimental trial is having two research teams working blindly and independently of each other, and that's the one that had me freaked out, because I like having access to drugs that are checked and tested by the FDA. And when the FDA administrator says things like that, I kind of worry about whether the aspirin that I give to my kid is safe.
Absolutely. Let's switch gears a little bit. We're obviously going to keep talking about Trump through probably all of our stories on this episode. But obviously also yesterday, another piece of news that came out was the release of the most recent job report, which still showed growth, but did not show the same growth that had been originally estimated or anticipated. And then obviously now we have questions about how do we think the Fed's going to respond to this. Unemployment sitting stable. We're looking about the addition of 100,000 new jobs every month. It's going to keep unemployment where it is, but there are still obviously those overarching questions of, not even necessarily at this point if, but when is the Fed going to lower the interest rate? I guess my question, Alexandra, is really twofold for you. What do you think the Fed's going to do? And more importantly, can Trump still claim that he's leading to the job growth he would like to be able to claim, and also keeping the economy at a place where his poll numbers should stay fairly neutral?
Well, there are several issues here. First of all, The job report itself was weaker than expected, and Trump pointed people through his tweets to the response by the market. The market went up, but the market went up in anticipation of a Fed response of lowering the interest rate. I don't know whether the Fed will react this quickly. They're not known to respond that immediately. So I mean, if the next quarter, if through the summer we see a continuous dip to the job market and we see other pressures to the economy, they will have to act and cut interest rates a bit. But an interest rate cut is a very blunt instrument to have an effect on the economy. And here, the underlying problems of the American economy, one is fundamental instability because of the political climate. Business just don't know what's happening tomorrow, and they can't plan because realistically, they hear about changing rules, changing regulations, deregulation, liberalization of this and that. But the reality is that those things are not likely to last because there is very little chance that any Democratic administration or even a Republican administration, but with the Democrats having more power in Congress, and I'm talking about one that doesn't involve Trump. I'm talking about more of a, regular type of administration, that a lot of these things are not going to be taken away. So, Trump is just signing executive orders and saying that he's going to do things, and his bureaucrats are basically cutting down programs willy-nilly without evaluation or anything else. I was talking to a friend who is an expert on bureaucratic politics and on the bureaucracy, and she was saying that this is not an attempt to reduce the size of the administrative state. This is basically taking a really huge, hatchet knife and just slashing whatever's in front of you without rhyme or reason. Like there is no evaluation, there is no assessment of anything. It's just happening, and that has huge consequences for a lot of things. But one of the things is that there is no credibility among the business community, and there shouldn't be, that these things are going to last. So they can't make decisions in many ways based on the cues that they're getting from this administration. Then, talking about jobs, one thing is that, and we have talked about this, and it is a well-known fact, the unemployment numbers are, in a sense, not the best evidence of how well society is doing, because the kind of jobs that are available for people are part-time jobs. They're jobs that are not, they're minimum wage jobs. They're not the kind of jobs where you can raise families, and that is a big problem. There is also the extra problem that any benefits that Americans in the middle class saw from the infamous tax cut have been erased because, Walmart increased its prices due to the tariffs against China. So actually, what we're paying around the country for products is going up. So all of that figures into market response and to the economy. And for a lot of people, a lot of economists are foreseeing a significant downturn within the next bureau too. These, of course, are things that are very hard to predict, but they
Well,
don't
and we
see
know
a
they're hard
healthy
to
economy.
predict because they predicted that downturn a year ago, and it still hasn't necessarily shown up. I mean, to your point, I think the thing, if I'm Trump, that concerns me about this is that the pace of hiring in May declined probably the most dramatically in sectors that were really dependent on trade, which, to your point, I think shows that the tariff impact is starting to take hold a little bit. And I don't think that's something that, obviously, as we talked about earlier, Trump's the best at in terms of thinking about spillover effect. The immediate political gain for that move was felt, but now we're dealing with the 6 months, 8 months, 12 months later when we start to see the economy respond to those policy switches, because whether he likes it or not, the economy doesn't move and adjust at the same speed that Trump does on policy.
That is absolutely the case. And it's not just the sectors hit by the tariffs where you lose employment, it's the whole agriculture and farming domain where it has been hit incredibly hard, both by tariffs on one hand and the weather with climate change. Like, my family was supposed to actually drive to Tulsa this past week for an event, and
You need a boat.
there was no way. You can't get past St. Louis. It's too dangerous. I'm not taking a 5-month-old in a car through Jonesboro if I'm going to be 10 feet underwater. The entire heartland is underwater. Like, the catastrophe, both in economic terms and in societal terms, is huge. And we have seen that the response from the government has not been sufficient when it comes to recovery efforts from natural disasters. Texas is not recovered. I'm not even going to mention the word Puerto Rico. Florida is not recovered.
The Panhandle's just finally getting its recovery bill passed.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and they barely got that bill through Congress. I mean, and that shows the inability of the administration to coordinate on policy, because you need people at the top who have plans and who are managers and who push these things through. And judging from this FDA administrator, they don't. A lot of these people don't have that.
Yeah, not at all. And I think this is a good bridgeway. I mean, we can keep talking, obviously, about the job report and how it ties together, but you've mentioned the Midwest, and then obviously we have the question over the tariffs on Mexico, which yesterday I thought we were going to be having one conversation today. Today we're going to be having a different conversation. But the idea of the threatened 5% escalating to up to 25% tariffs on certain imports from Mexico is an effort to force Mexico to take ownership of some of the Central American migration patterns through their country into the U.S. And it looks like, as of last night, Trump has declared victory and success in this. I'm not sure I've seen enough detail to really know what's happened or to know whether there will be an actual impact. But even getting Mexico to publicly state that we will do more to assist U.S. efforts to ensure that there is not a continued northern migration through Mexico into the U.S. does seem like a step forward. I mean, obviously, for Trump supporters, this is another case of he has called out a country, he has put a pretty clear threat in place, and he's seen some type of reaction, some type of response. Now, whether that's going to be long-standing or something where Mexico's saying it today but won't be able to continue long-term, we're not sure. But it does seem like a step in the right direction. Obviously, Chuck Schumer thinks it's a step in the right direction, even if it's facetious in terms of saying that this is so great that President Trump has won this battle. We will never have to hear about Mexican immigration again, which we all know is not true or realistic. But what's your response to, number one, the threat of the tariffs in the first place, and number two, the deal that was brokered yesterday?
The threat of the tariffs is just astounding to me, given the relationship with Mexico and how integrated the Mexican economy and the U.S. economy are. Basically, on economic, if you see it from an economic perspective, Mexico is the 51st state of the United States. We get a huge amount of agricultural products. Like all the tomatoes we get are from Mexico. All of our avocados are from Mexico. All kinds of important food stuff come from Mexico. And, nobody's going to enjoy it if the price of tomatoes is $15 a pound.
You're leaving out tequila.
Yes, exactly. It's because I'm a vodka drinker. So, that's the only one that, Mexico won't get me on that one. But the consequences for Mexico and for us of instability in Mexico are huge. Because basically, essentially, by threatening tariffs and imposing tariffs on Mexico, forget about the fact that we are paying for the tariff. The impact, the negative impact that it can have on the Mexican economy can be incredibly destabilizing. Mexico, only in the past 10, 15 years, has been able to turn its economy around and actually have a growth level that is able to provide for the basics for the population. Mexico has a huge problem with police violence, societal violence, with gangs, the drug war. Weakening the government of Mexico and weakening the economy of Mexico increases instability in the country, makes all of these things more dangerous and more threatening, which basically in the medium term means that more Mexicans are going to want to come to the United States and cross the border. So
ultimately, the exact opposite of what we wanted to do.
Exactly. So this is basically, hitting yourself in the face. It's
but
a really
shoring up the base
counterproductive.
at the same time.
Absolutely. And every move that the Trump administration seems to be, this is an administration that is not even thinking, it's thinking about the base in a very, very narrow sense, because the Republican base is diverse. Since 2016, we have sort of come to boil it down to, the guy with the MAGA hat who is, can barely speak proper English and is fat and is just is a cartoon, right? The white guy who's really happy to hear Trump say bad things about others.
Yeah, and to be honest here, it's the same characterization that people gave the Tea Party as being a bunch of tinfoil hat-wearing freaks, when in reality they were able to carry 8, 9, 10 people to the U.S. Senate using just that approach.
And you have basically, boiled down to a stereotype who the Republican voter is, and who the Trump base is maybe slightly different from who the Republican is. But certainly the president is laser focused on a very, very specific segment, which is the white evangelical, very, very conservative part of his base. Which is why we're seeing now all of a sudden money being pulled out of universities that are doing research with existing gene lines that are based on aborted fetuses. We are seeing these signals that are going straight to that particular group. And also the immigration stuff. The immigration thing has been Trump's signature policy, and he is dead set on, delivering something, delivering this wall and delivering on the immigration thing. And the latest thing that I heard, which was pretty scary, was that he has instructed, as part of a renovation of the existing wall, the barrier, to be painted pitch black, so that when you touch the metal, you get burned, and that he wants to put spikes at the top uh, of the barrier. That's pretty medieval. But
It is medieval, but here's the question. I don't think Trump actually wants to burn people or hurt people. But I think it's showing that if you don't want to play in the middle ground of, I want a safe barrier that keeps people out, if I have to raise to this level so that we eventually fall back to where it makes the most sense. I mean, the guy is good about throwing out extreme alternatives, and then it's us trying to figure out what's the actual intention.
well, I think somebody who is willing to throw out extreme alternatives is also willing to accept these extreme alternatives as legitimate, because there are things that, for most people, there are places where you don't go. For example, like, I want to discipline my child, but I will never tell my child, if you don't do X, I'm going to put your hand on the stove and burn it. Because I think that this is, outside the norms of, appropriate behavior for a parent, and B, because I do not want DCF to show up at my door, because it's actually not legal. But he is willing to break laws to make his point. And actually, the best example of that relates to the border is, the new policy on what they plan to do with kids at the border, and the fact that they're yanking out educational programs and legal aid for the refugee children who are held in border detention facilities. It is illegal. It is plainly illegal. But he doesn't have a problem behaving in illegal ways if it signals toughness on one hand, and like it pleases his core constituency, who also don't have a strong, negative response to the fact that something like this is illegal.
No, and I think what's happening on with the refugee children right now is obviously a topic of relevance here to this greater conversation. Obviously, I mean, I'm going to come from the mindset of we don't owe anyone, child or otherwise, more than what is quote unquote legally required. But I also do see the concerns, not just the educational piece, the recreation time, with the legal rights training. For kids that are already in scared, awful situations, I don't see what the benefit is long term to not helping them continue to grow, develop, and at least feel safe. And again, I use safe in quotes here just because I don't know what safe looks like for a refugee child. I've never been in that situation. Obviously, it's one where it's hard to imagine the level of fear and terror. But what we can do to minimize that is likely going to lead to better long-term relationships than by stripping out everything and basically locking the kid in a room for the length of time they're stuck in a detention center. I think that's hard to argue against, no matter where you fall. Even though when I look at it from a pure political, legal standpoint, I'm kind of like, well, we have a checklist of things we have to do. There are really cheap, easy ways to fill those things without necessarily getting at the spirit of the law. But I mean, for the love of God, when it's kids that are involved, the kid didn't choose to end up on that board.
Exactly. And also, from a longer standing perspective, think of it this way: whether these kids stay in the U.S. because their cases are adjudicated and a judge says no, they have to stay, or they're sent back. You're saying these kids are staying in these facilities for a year, 2 years. It could be a long time. Depriving them of education and depriving them of basic emotional stability, which is involved with recreation, with human contact, with like being in a humane environment, has long-term emotional and material consequences for these kids. So basically, you're helping these kids, you're putting them into the crime pipeline, essentially, because these kids will have less education than makes them competitive. They will have less resilience because of these very horrific experiences. And then whether they stay here or they go back to their countries, they're going to be a problem population that had no reason to be a problem population. You're creating it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the key is what we're doing there. And I think, if we're going to say this is budget-based and budget-driven, there are other areas I would much rather see cut, attack, change, as opposed to anything involving kids that find themselves on the border through no choice of their own.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And, the reason that there has developed a crisis at the border is because the Trump administration has made the decision that every single person who seeks to cross the border, regardless of the reason offered, will be detained. They make no differentiation across types of border crossers, across types of people who are seeking to cross the border. So if you are treating refugees and economic migrants and everybody else from any country in the exact same way, then you're creating a crisis. This is not because such a huge number of people have showed up at the border. We had periods where a lot more people came through the border, but there were other procedures in place to basically deal with them rather than detain them. And clearly, detention, putting them in prison, is not really affecting their behavior. The idea is that if you put them in jail, other people will be basically deterred and not come. But when your choice is between, a war-torn neighborhood in Guatemala where your life is at risk, trying to get through the American border may not be such a bad deal.
I don't disagree with that, but that is where I come back to, for those individuals, trying to get through the border may not be that big of a deal, but that doesn't make it my responsibility to make it easy or welcoming at the same time. The moral and the legal there for me start to blur a little bit more because I feel like anybody could show up on the border from anywhere with a right or a made up or a fabricated sob story that would merit full inclusion. And we see this with asylum here, where, I feel bad today for people that have actual legitimate asylum claims because there are so many fake asylum claims or stretch asylum claims that it waters down the ones that really would be at imminent risk. So it's figuring out how do we pull out the people that really do need the opportunity and need to get out of a bad situation versus those that are just looking for something different and show up with the same tale.
The bar for asylum claims to be approved is so unbelievably high.
Absolutely. Yeah, they don't make it easy, but just the fact that you can file it and try to make that claim.
But, in any humane society, you should give the benefit of the reason to somebody who says, I am in danger. Like, what do you do if a person shows up at the door and says, somebody with, a knife is coming after me, please, give me refuge, just hide me behind your couch. Don't you have a moral responsibility to a certain extent to help?
I do, but at that point I would argue that I would have the same moral responsibility if every North Korean filed paperwork tomorrow saying that they're in imminent danger under their leader and they all wanted to come here. That'd be the same moral equivalency to some degree.
Oh, I agree. I mean, yes, there are large numbers of people who are in danger, and if they were to apply for asylum, the moral responsibility would be to basically help them. And yes, there are logistical and practical considerations there, but the moral responsibility remains separate.
I agree. It is separate, and I think that's the difficulty: is how do we bring those moral, not requirements, but that moral pool together with what is practical or realistic. And then obviously comes back to diplomacy and how do we help other countries. If you look at it in a situation like I mentioned, admittedly, the answer would be you get rid of the problem that's causing all of those people to feel that way as opposed to catering to all of the individual people. And that's significantly easier said than done, as history has shown us over and over.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, unlike what the people believe here, most people don't want to leave their countries. And most people, are happy with what they have so long that they have enough to eat and that, they're not in danger. Because if economic theory, microeconomic theory, that basically immigration is an issue of supply and demand, were true, given the discrepancy between salaries in basically every part of the world and the US, you would have basically 5 billion people seeking to come to the United States. But that's not the case. And the reason that that's not the case is that economic factors are not the strongest drivers of migration demand across the world. People don't want to leave their countries unless they have to. It's very few, it's only a very small percentage of the population that is risk-seeking enough to want to actually move for the purposes of advancement. Most people will only move if they feel unsafe.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think people want to leave. I don't think this is something where we have, a line of willing movers that are saying, I just want to go here to move forward. And I think that's another thing we have to obviously figure out: how do we factor that into our considerations and our conversations. Obviously, what I like about this week is that, to some degree, all of these stories have tied together very nicely. And with the fact of the job report, how we could respond to that, what we're seeing with the Mexican tariff, and obviously the deal that was ultimately reached, and then the changes in what we're seeing with borders and kids. I mean, it suggests that there's obviously that larger global problem that, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on the lens you take, we'll likely be talking about here for quite a while to come. So I think that's a good place to end for this episode. I want to thank everybody for listening. We hope you like what you heard. Listener support's what keeps the show going. We truly appreciate it. You can subscribe to the show, which also really helps us out. It's easy to do in the podcast app. You click that triangle, typically up in the upper right-hand corner somewhere. Word of mouth is obviously our best advertising, so please, if you like what you're hearing from us, continue to share that out, and we'll greatly appreciate that. And leave reviews or ratings on iTunes as well. If you have questions, comments, corrections, random thoughts you want to share, you can reach out to us at mail@politicsguys.com, our Facebook page where we tend to communicate throughout the week, share stories. In my case, I like to lob out grenades and watch people respond to them. It's facebook.com/politicsguys page, and we're on Twitter at politicsguys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Michael Baranowski, Jay Carson, Bruce Johnson, Wilmer Moreno, and Benji Fishman. Today's show was produced by Will Miller. We'll be back with a new show on Wednesday, and we hope you'll join us then.